Welcome, Specimen! We are back with our dear nuclear disaster going off in the background. What we have for today is checking how things are going in the raid, because we checked the first time for only a couple of days into the season last time. Now it's been a full week. We have gotten 2 resets in the new season 2. We have also gotten, of course, way more guilds getting into Mythic. Last time we checked, we mostly could only check Heroic. We could only see the numbers and how, for example, specs were doing, how many specs were playing, but most of that was relegated to Heroic. Now, however, we do have a few more numbers. We do have some more things that are worth looking at when it comes to Mythic, which is ultimately the more important part of raiding. At the very least, for when you want to get an idea of who is playing what's best, what's stronger, you look for Mythic. So, looking for Mythic at the start of this season. Let's not mince words, let's get straight to the point. I'm going to show you how the situation was in the first roughly 3 weeks of the start of Season 1. So we are not looking at how things were like 2 weeks ago, at the very end of Season 1, because that doesn't matter. Progress was done by then, bosses were falling in a couple of minutes, it wasn't really that relevant. Let's instead look at when things were relevant. Let's look at when players were progressing in Vault of the Incarnates. And the situation was like this. As I often reminded all of you, there was a significant dominance of melee DPS. Just look at this. Outlaw, Unholy, Subtlety, Frost Decay, Enhancement, Havoc, and Windwalker make up the top 7. So, top 7 DPS the first few weeks of Season 1, all exclusively melee DPS. That was the situation at the start of Season 1. And of course, as a result, the bottom of the DPS was made up of many ranged specs. So, that was the case at the start of the first season. Now, let's go at the start of the second season. Now, this is the situation at the top. Well, first of all, we do notice something quite different, because at the top you have Demo, you have Shadow Priest, Affliction, Elemental, and then you have Subtlety, Destruction, Survival, and Devastation. So in the top 8, this time around, we have not quite the opposite, not quite nearly as ranged DPS dominated like it was for melee in Season 1, but still, the top is made up primarily of ranged DPS. What might jump to the eye is the triple Warlock presence in the top 8, even in this case in the top 6 of DPS. You have all 3 Warlock specs. That's quite unique of a situation. Amongst the fewer better performing melee DPS, the only one that stands out is Subtlety Rogue. Because yes, even though survival is there, as we will see from the popularity of the specs, survival is still very scarcely played, so you have to take these results with a grain of salt when looking at survival, the performance of survival. So once we put the results next to each other, we can find some similarities. We can find the similarity, for example, that Fire Mage is still not doing too hot, no pun intended, between both starts of the season. We can also see that specs like Beast Mastery Hunter is also doing quite badly compared to the start of last season, more or less the same. There are other things jumping to the eye, for example, the reversal. Previously, you had Elemental Shaman doing quite badly, with Enhancement Shaman doing very well. Now we have a reverse. Now it's Elemental doing better and Enhancement doing worse. Previously, we had both of the DK specs being at the top. Now they are towards the bottom half of the results. Surprisingly, this was something we mentioned in Heroic Raiding when we checked the first few days of the season as well. Marksmanship is doing much better. So at the start of last season, Marksmanship was towards the bottom, just like Beast Mastery. Instead, now Marksmanship is a much more viable option in the raid for hunters. So that is what things change from, let's just say, what mattered. Let's just say the start of the season of Season 1 versus the start of the season of Season 2. To further show you how sometimes things can be misleading, how you can be prone to getting baited by things like these, by things like the heroic results. That's what we checked the first time, because we didn't have enough Mythic logs. We were like, okay, fine, let's just look at how things are going in heroic. But look at how quickly things changed from the results of heroic in the first week versus the results of Mythic in the second week. For example, you can see we were very happy and surprised about Arcane Mage doing super well in the first week of Heroic, and now Arcane Mage has lost some 10 positions in Mythic. Same thing goes for Unholy. Unholy was also very high like Arcane, now Unholy lost some 15 positions compared to Heroic. Some of these specs have continued their good performance going from Heroic to Mythic, because you see that Subtlety is still at the top, you see Destro is still doing quite well, Red Paladin has lost a bit but is still doing positive in Mythic, same goes for Devastation Evoker, Shadow Priest are still performing quite well in Mythic at the same time. So now that we are doing the swap, now that we are doing the jump from Heroic to Mythic, that's how things have progressed in the raid so far. This is of course still bound to change, mostly because we don't quite know exactly how many of the specs performing like this, as you see, do have their 4-piece set bonus, right? 4-piece is going to be a good advantage to quite a few specs and classes compared to Season 1, so now, for sure, all of the results you see here are not done with every spec having the 4-piece set bonus. So we do have more room for things changing in the next week, in the next couple of weeks, where it should be more likely that most of the DPS specs will have a 4-piece set bonus in Mythic difficulty. If you want to go into further details when it comes to Mythic, this is the DPS done on Khazara. Khazara might be relevant because there is a bit of movement on Khazara, plus it's a pure single target fight. It's the only fight out of the early bosses which is going to be completely single target. So you do get to see a few things based on the performance of single target specs. In here, for example, we mentioned how all 3 Warlock specs are super high right now. But when you look at Khazara, look at where Destruction is. Now, suddenly, Destruction is much lower. This gives you a hint, this gives you a message that while Destruction might be high, overall, it's definitely not because they are very strong in single target. And that's why they are doing so poorly, or so much worse, on Khazara, which only has 1 target. And you can also get other messages, like for example, Arcane is now doing better, so it might give you the message that Arcane is better of a spec on single target. Then Experiments, which is a 1-target fight into a cleave 2-target fight, even though you kind of want to focus 1 target only, into some small burst of AoE when you dispel the players and you spawn the bombs and you want to burst them down. So, talking about bursting down, suddenly now Devastation Evoker, a very good burst spec, is now one of the better ones. Also, talking about 2 targets, now suddenly Destruction, the spec with Havoc that can target 2 targets at once, is also now doing much better. So that is how the performance can be changing based on the type of fight. The deeper we go into the raid and the more guilds we have killing certain bosses, the overall chart, the overall rankings of the DPS will change based on which type of profile the fight has. If the next fight, where we will be getting more and more logs, is a pure single target fight, like for example Rashok, which is the next boss fight that many guilds have to progress to. Rashok being a pure single target fight will mean that the overall rankings of the DPS will change in favor of the specs that are doing better in single target, because that's Rashok. After Rashok, you're gonna get Zaskarn. So guilds will progress and start killing Zaskarn. Zaskarn has a whole bunch of ads spawning for some cleave, multi-dotting and whatnot. So that's what's gonna show up in the overall rankings doing better, because that's the type of fight that Zaskarn is. So at the moment, really, we can only look at the logs for Khazara, for Experiments, for Amalgamation Chamber, and for Assault of the Zakali. So basically the first 4 bosses. We still don't have that many logs for Rashok. So this is how the results are for the moment in Mythic, for the first basically half, almost half of the raid. That's for the DPS. For the healers, I would be quite happy to say that the situation is much better compared to the past, because when we talk about the past, we are still talking about the entry level, the first few weeks of Mythic in Season 1, and this was the result. As you remember, likely, the situation was that Resto Druid and more importantly Preservation Evoker were doing much better than the rest of the healers. In terms of HPS, they simply had much more compared to Holy Priest or Resto Shaman or Mistweaver Monk. That was the result in the first weeks. Now look and compare the results of that start of the season with the current results of the current start of this season. Now, the situation is of course much more pleasing to the eye because all of the healers seem to be very, very even. Very, very smooth. Yes, Mistweaver Monk is lagging behind a bit, Discipline Priest is lagging behind a bit, but nowhere near the level of disparity that we have seen in Season 1. Now, you could make a case for bringing basically whichever healer you want in the raid. Maybe you can start thinking about what healers can bring on top of healing. Because if all of the healers are very, very close, then we might as well start thinking about, for example, do we want to bring more priests? Because priests also give us power infusion. Or do we want to bring more evokers? Because evokers have stronger cooldowns. Do we favor having stronger cooldowns, or do we favor having more damage because of more power infusions, for example? That is something you can afford to do right now because the healers are so even. Back in Season 1, even if a second Holy Priest gave you one more power infusion, the second Holy Priest was so far behind a Preservation Evoker or so far behind a Resto Druid that you couldn't make up the lack of healing of Holy Priest just by giving power infusion to a DPS. But now the things are tied enough, close enough between one another that it is a viable alternative for groups, for raid leaders, for compositions to be more diverse in your choice of healers. So that is also quite good, quite the better result compared to the beginning of Season 1. Once again, same disclaimer we have had for the DPS when it comes to healers. Perhaps not all of these healers have gotten their 4-piece set bonus. Also, even more relevant since healers are likely to be given less, to be given fewer tier pieces than DPS players. For example, even for me, even in our guild, part of these results of healers will be us progressing through several bosses and none of the healers had the 4-piece set bonus, for example. So that is something that will happen. Healers will be behind in the acquisition of the tier. And that's something that can impact the results, because as we mentioned multiple times when we were talking about the power of the tier sets, healers do have quite a different power level. The strongest of the tier sets right now are for Discipline, Preservation Evoker, and Resto Druid. Then you have Holy Priest and Holy Paladin, and then you have Mistweaver Monk, and lower down you have Resto Shaman, which has the weakest of the tier sets. So the more the healers get their hands on their set bonuses, the more it might change these results, which at the moment, happily enough, are very, very tied and very, very balanced, especially compared to the beginning of Season 1. So, much better situation when it comes to healers compared to Season 1. When it comes to DPS, I guess it's up to you to judge how the situation is. You might be happy to not see once another melee DPS dominance compared to Season 1. Maybe you're not nearly as happy because you were a melee DPS player yourself. We do still have some of the issues we still saw in Season 1, which is the fact that even despite the several buffs, it does not look like Blizzard has been able to bring mages to be super relevant. Arcane Mage has proven to be quite good on single target and a pretty decent option on single target, but besides that, mages are still doing quite poorly. Another problem being Druid. Even after the mini rework and then multiple changes to balance Druid, they still don't seem to be able to make them, to put them in a good enough situation. Those are the two things I would find more worrying when it comes to the situation at the start of this season. The rest, I think it's quite acceptable, it's quite decent. I don't think there are too many outrageous situations when it comes to the state of the DPS in the raid. Of course, We're not talking too much about tanks because once again the tanks in the raid are mostly pointless. Generally speaking, you will be playing what is more popular in Mythic Plus. And to no surprise, the more popular pick in Mythic Plus is Protection Paladin, therefore the more popular pick in the raid is Protection Paladin. The second most popular pick in Mythic Plus is Blood DK, therefore the second most popular tank in the raid is Blood DK. And the least popular tanks in Mythic Plus are Guardian Druid and Prot Warrior, and therefore the two least played tanks in the raid are Guardian Druid and Prot Warrior. So when it comes to tanks, really there isn't too much to talk about. It's not really that much about strategy, about min-maxing the composition of tanks. Is more just to follow what is going on in Mythic Plus and who is popular in Mythic Plus. You can still have the caveat, which has not been a thing for a while, the caveat where you can play a Vengeance Demon Hunter and Vengeance Demon Hunter can be super popular because Havoc is very weak. So you have no Havoc in the raid, you need the Demon Hunter debuff, so Vengeance is the popular tank. Or you need a Monk debuff in the raid, Mistweaver is not popular, Windwalker is not popular, therefore Brewmaster is the most popular tank. This is not the case right now. Windwalker is more than popular enough to not need a Brewmaster. Havoc is of course the most popular of the melee DPS, so you don't need a Vengeance Demon Hunter tank, so that is not a problem nowadays, which makes it much more easy for tanks to simply play what's strong in Mythic Plus and play it in the raid as well. It's not really nearly as much of an important thing to look at when it comes to the performance and the presence of the specs in the raid when it comes to tanks compared to healers and then more so to the DPS. So this is a situation in the second week of the season where we get to see the Mythic raiding situation for the first time. After looking at Heroic last week, this is how things are shaping up to be for the first few bosses, the first 4 or so bosses in Mythic, in the new raid, in Aberrus. So for now, as we wait for more developments, as we wait for more and more of the specs to get their 4-piece set bonus and more of the specs maybe to get some hotfixes, buffs or nerfs from Blizzard, this is how we find ourselves. And just like how we found ourselves, we are also going to be leaving ourselves. We are starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking all of the Patreon supporters, which did it so not for free, but you can do it for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, as well as following me over on my Twitter and following me over on my stream on Twitch. Those are still perfectly fine ways to show your support without spending a single cent. With these things out of the way, thank you once again guys for watching the video. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I think, based on my inside sources, which are none, that we are gonna get some hotfix tuning to specs by the next week. That's my hunch.